The council chamber smelled like fear and desperation, which was saying something considering most of the delegates didn't even breathe oxygen. I am Korthval, chief xenobiologist of the Galactic Assembly, and I had seen enough supposedly intelligent species make stupid decisions to fill a library. But this? This was about to set a new record. They want to do what? Supreme Arbiter Telm's voice cracked across 3 harmonic frequencies, a sure sign she was about to lose her composure entirely. Ambassador Rickshaw, the human representative, stood perfectly still at the center podium. Humans had this unnerving habit of making direct eye contact when delivering bad news, like they wanted you to really feel the weight of their insanity. "We're volunteering for the Keresh front," he repeated, calm as someone ordering lunch. "All available military forces, effective immediately." Let me back up for those of you who aren't familiar with the galactic situation, and honestly, I envy your ignorance. The Keresh were a silicon-based nightmare species that had been eating their way through the outer colonies for 6 cycles. Not metaphorically eating, mind you. Actually consuming entire settlements, processing biological matter into fuel for their hive ships. They were unstoppable, relentless, and had about as much interest in negotiation as a black hole has in reversing its appetite. Every species that had fought them directly had been reduced to scattered refugees within weeks. The Vrelics? Gone. The Morphids with their legendary adaptive armor? Barely 300 survivors left. The Assembly's strategy had devolved into an increasingly pathetic holding pattern, basically running away slightly faster than the Keresh could chase. And now the humans, who had joined the Assembly barely 20 cycles ago, wanted to throw themselves into the meat grinder. Voluntarily. You understand the casualty projections? Counselor Vexmara asked, her optical clusters dimming with what I recognized as pity. Based on current models, you're looking at 87% losses in the first engagement alone. 96% within a standard month. Rickshaw nodded once, sharp and military. We've run the numbers ourselves. Our projections are actually worse than yours. We're estimating 91% initial casualties. Stunned silence filled the chamber. It was Telm who finally found words. Then. Why? The human's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it didn't look so tired. Because someone has to. Because you're running out of systems to abandon. Because in another cycle, maybe 2, the Keresh will have enough momentum that nothing will stop them. He paused, and his next words hit like a hammer. And because we've been here before. I felt my dorsal ridge stiffen involuntarily. The humans weren't exaggerating. Their homeworld history was a cavalcade of near-extinction events that they'd somehow clawed their way through. Wars that consumed entire continents, plagues that killed billions, environmental collapses that should have ended them permanently. They had this disturbing tendency to stare at impossible odds and decide to punch them in the face anyway. Let me make sure I understand the scope of your proposal, I said, accessing my datapad with 3 manipulator limbs. You're offering 247 capital ships, roughly 3 million ground forces, and your entire stockpile of kinetic and energy weapons. That's 83% of your total military capacity. 86%, actually, Rickshaw corrected. We're holding back minimal defensive forces for the home system. Everything else goes to the front. This is madness. Counselor YRTH slammed both primary appendages against his desk, his chromatophores flashing angry crimson. You'll be slaughtered. Your species will be functionally extinct within the cycle. Maybe, Rickshaw agreed. His voice stayed level, almost conversational. But if we do nothing, your species will be extinct too. All of them. The Keresh don't stop, Counselor. They don't negotiate, they don't consolidate, they don't pause. They consume. And right now, they're winning because everyone's too afraid to actually fight them. The accusation hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Because he wasn't wrong, was he? The Assembly had the numbers, the technology, the resources. What we didn't have was the will. Every species was too busy calculating their own survival odds, too focused on preserving their genetic legacy to risk actual confrontation. Except apparently the humans, who had looked at those same odds and shrugged. Teln's speaking membranes quivered as she processed the implications. If we accept your offer, you understand that the Assembly cannot guarantee support. Our own forces are stretched maintaining the evacuation corridors. We understand, Rickshaw said. We're not asking for support. We're asking for coordinates and current intelligence on Keresh positions. We'll handle the rest. I couldn't help myself. This is strategically insane. You're guaranteeing your own destruction. The human finally looked directly at me, and I wished he hadn't. There was something in those binocular eyes that made my secondary heart skip cycles. We've been destroyed before, Korthval. Rome fell. The Library of Alexandria burned. The Mughal Empire collapsed. The old United States fractured in civil war. We've watched our civilizations crumble into dust more times than we can count. His voice dropped lower, harder. But we're still here. We always find a way to be still here. Past survival doesn't guarantee future success, Vexmara observed quietly. No, Rickshaw agreed. But it does teach you that the only way to survive impossible situations is to do impossible things. The vote took 3 hours of debate that accomplished absolutely nothing except confirming what everyone already knew. The humans were going to the Keresh front with or without official sanction. The Assembly could either support them or watch them march off to die unsanctioned. In the end, the Council voted to approve the deployment with minimal aid commitments, basically giving the humans permission to commit species suicide with our blessing. I should have left it there. Filed my reports, recorded my observations, moved on to less depressing assignments. But I've always had this character flaw that resembles curiosity, and humans had become my morbid fascination. So I requested permission to embed with their fleet as an official observer. They said yes, which should have been my first warning that human decision-making operated on fundamentally alien principles. The human flagship was called the Indomitable, which struck me as either optimistic or ironic, I wasn't sure which. Captain Marcus Hale greeted me at the airlock with a firm handshake that nearly crushed 2 of my finger analogs. Humans had this obsession with physical contact as social bonding, which always seemed needlessly risky to me. Welcome aboard, Korthval, Hale said, releasing my mangled appendage. I hear you're documenting our suicide mission for posterity. I checked my translator for errors. Nope, he'd actually said that. I prefer to think of it as recording strategic deployment under suboptimal conditions. Hale laughed, which humans did when they found something amusing or were completely losing their grip on sanity. Sometimes both. I like you already. Come on, I'll show you around before things get interesting. The Indomitable was smaller than equivalent assembly vessels, more cramped, with less automation and more crew. Everywhere I looked, humans were preparing for battle with this focused intensity that felt almost religious. They checked weapons, ran system diagnostics, drilled combat scenarios. There was no panic, no resignation. If anything, they seemed almost eager. Your crew seems remarkably calm considering the statistical certainty of their deaths, I observed as we passed through the main hangar bay. Hale paused to watch a squadron of fighter pilots running pre-flight checks. You want to know the secret to human psychology, Korthval? We're really good at lying to ourselves. We tell ourselves stories, build narratives where we're the heroes, convince ourselves that this time will be different. He turned to look at me, and his expression was complicated in ways I couldn't fully parse. And sometimes, just often enough to keep us stupid and hopeful, those stories turn out to be true. But the odds. The odds said the 13 colonies couldn't beat the British Empire. The odds said we'd never put someone on our moon. The odds said a lot of things that ended up being wrong. Hale started walking again, and I hurried to keep pace. Look, I'm not saying we're going to win. The math is pretty clear. But we're going to fight anyway, because that's what humans do. We fight. We adapt. We survive. And if we can't survive, we at least make sure to inconvenience the hell out of whatever killed us. Over the next several ship cycles, I watched the human fleet prepare for deployment. They trained constantly, these bipedal primates pushing their soft bodies to apparent breaking points and then somehow pushing further. Their tactical briefings involved shouting, arguing, and what they called creative problem solving, which seemed to mean ignoring established doctrine in favor of whatever insane scheme someone thought might work. Commander Lisa Park, the fleet's tactical officer, explained their battle strategy to me in terms that made my neural clusters ache. Conventional warfare doesn't work against the Keresh because they don't have conventional weak points. They're a distributed intelligence with redundant systems. So we're going asymmetric. Asymmetric how? I asked, already regretting the question. She pulled up a holographic display showing the Keresh fleet positions. We're going to hit them everywhere at once with everything we have. No strategic reserve, no fallback position, no retreat. Total commitment. The theory is that even distributed intelligence has processing limits. If we force them to respond to simultaneous threats across multiple vectors, we might create exploitable gaps in their coordination. I stared at the tactical display, trying to find the part where this wasn't complete insanity. That's not a strategy. That's barely controlled chaos. Park's grin was sharp enough to cut hull plating. Now you're getting it. The jump to the Keresh front took 6 cycles through hyperspace. I spent most of that time interviewing crew members, trying to understand what drove them to volunteer for certain death. The answers were disturbingly varied. Private James Torres, a young soldier who barely looked old enough to operate heavy weaponry, told me he'd signed up because his sister had been killed in a Keresh raid on an outer colony. Someone's gotta make them pay, he said simply, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the fleet's chief medical officer, explained that she'd calculated the long-term trajectory of Keresh expansion. In 20 cycles, they'll reach Earth. My grandchildren will be facing them regardless. I'd rather fight now, while we still have resources, than wait until we're backed into a corner with no options. Chief Engineer Pavel Volkov just shrugged when I asked his motivation. Where else would I be? Sitting on Earth, waiting. Watching other species die while I pretend it's not my problem. He spat something that might have been tobacco but could have been anything. That's not living. That's just slow dying. They all had their reasons, but underneath the individual motivations, I detected a common thread. These humans had decided, individually and collectively, that their lives meant something only if they were spent in opposition to the Keresh threat. They had transformed their mortality from something to fear into something to weaponize. It was absolutely terrifying. The transition from hyperspace into the Keresh war zone was violent enough to make my inner equilibrium sacs rebel against basic physics. Alarms screamed across every frequency, and the view screen lit up with enough hostile contacts to make my optical nerves want to disconnect entirely. Well, Captain Hale said, settling into his command chair like he was sitting down for dinner, that's more of them than intelligence predicted. Adjust fire control solutions accordingly. More than predicted. The display showed at least 400 Keresh vessels, ranging from small corvette analogs to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the human fleet. They moved in perfectly coordinated swarms, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that I knew represented active targeting protocols. All ships, this is Hale, the captain spoke into fleet-wide communications. Initiate combat spread formation Delta. Remember, we're not trying to win a fair fight. We're trying to be the most annoying problem they've ever had to solve. Make them regret ever leaving their home nebula. Execute. The human fleet exploded into motion, and I mean that almost literally. Ships broke formation and scattered in what looked like random directions, each vessel accelerating on different vectors with apparently no coordination whatsoever. It looked like complete chaos, like watching children throw toys in random directions. Except it wasn't random at all. I watched the tactical display with growing comprehension as the human ships began their assault. They weren't engaging the Keresh directly. Instead, they were creating overlapping fields of fire, forcing the enemy to split their attention across dozens of simultaneous threats. Fighters launched from carriers and immediately dispersed, targeting communication nodes on the larger Keresh vessels. Destroyers made high-speed attack runs and peeled away before the enemy could concentrate fire. The heavy cruisers hung back just far enough to provide supporting bombardment while staying mobile. The Keresh, used to opponents who maintained formation and fought predictably, seemed genuinely confused. Their response patterns kept shifting, trying to adapt to the constantly changing threat parameters. And that confusion, that split-second delay in coordination, was exactly what the humans had been counting on. Target package acquired, Commander Park announced from tactical. Firing solution locked. All batteries, commence bombardment on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. The Indomitable shuddered as every weapon system fired simultaneously. Kinetic projectiles, energy beams, missile clusters, experimental plasma charges, everything the humans had packed into their ships erupted outward in a symphony of destruction that was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. A Keresh heavy cruiser, approximately 3 times our mass, took the full brunt of the assault. Its bioarmor held for roughly 4 seconds before catastrophic failures cascaded through its structure. The ship didn't explode so much as it disintegrated, chunks of silicon-based tissue vaporizing into clouds of superheated particles. One down, Hale said calmly. 273 to go. Helm, evasive pattern Epsilon. Don't let them get a clean shot. The battle descended into absolute mayhem after that. The Keresh, realizing that the humans weren't following any recognizable tactical doctrine, shifted to pure overwhelming force. They concentrated fire on individual human vessels, and the results were exactly as brutal as the projections had predicted. I watched the destroyer, Relentless, take a direct hit from a Keresh bioplasma weapon. The ship's shields lasted maybe a second before the hull itself began to melt. Emergency klaxons wailed as the crew evacuated, launching escape pods in all directions. Most of those pods were vaporized by follow-up fire before they could reach minimum safe distance. 1,700 people gone in less than 30 seconds. The cruiser, Defiant, lasted longer, fighting back even as Keresh boarding organisms breached the hull. I could hear the captain's final transmission over the fleet channel, ordering all hands to overload the reactor. The resulting explosion took out 2 Keresh escorts and damaged a third. 3,000 more casualties, deliberately chosen. This is insane, I whispered, watching ship after ship disappear from the tactical display. You're losing vessels faster than you can damage them. Hale didn't look away from his screens. We're losing ships, yes. But look closer, Korthval. Really look. I forced my optical clusters to focus past the immediate carnage to the broader tactical picture. And that's when I saw it. The Keresh fleet, despite their numerical superiority, was fragmenting. The distributed intelligence that made them so effective was being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of decisions they had to make. Human ships were everywhere, attacking from every angle, refusing to settle into predictable patterns. The Keresh were winning individual engagements but losing overall cohesion. You're not trying to destroy them, I realized. You're trying to make them stupid. Now you're thinking like a human, Park said, her fingers dancing across tactical controls. We can't beat them in a straight fight. But we can confuse them, overload their processing capacity, force them to make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, we exploit those mistakes until they learn better. Then we change tactics and confuse them all over again. A squadron of human fighters, no bigger than shuttles, made a suicide run straight through a gap in the Keresh formation. They dumped their entire payload of antimatter charges directly into a dreadnought's propulsion system and kept flying, using their remaining momentum to ram secondary targets. The dreadnought's engines destabilized and went critical, triggering a chain reaction that gutted 3 nearby vessels. 42 pilots dead. 4 enemy capital ships destroyed or disabled. The mathematics of attrition were straightforward. The humans were dying at exactly the rate predicted. But they were taking the Keresh with them, and more importantly, they were teaching the galaxy's most terrifying predators something they'd apparently never experienced before. Fear. I could see it in the Keresh movement patterns as the battle wore on. They started pulling back from the most aggressive human advances. They hesitated before committing to attacks. They began prioritizing their own survival over maximizing damage. The humans were proving to be prey that bit back hard enough to make predators cautious. 6 hours into the engagement, the human fleet had been reduced to 68 functional vessels. They'd lost over 170 ships, roughly 70% of their starting strength. By any rational military standard, they should have been retreating, preserving what remained of their forces. Instead, Hale ordered a general advance. All ships, converge on the primary Keresh command cluster, he transmitted. Everything we have left, straight down their throats. No holding back, no second chances. This is what we came here to do. Captain, that's their strongest defensive position, Park observed, though her tone suggested she was pointing out facts rather than objecting. We'll lose everything. Probably, Hale agreed. But if we crack their command structure, the entire fleet loses coordination for at least 20 minutes. That's enough time for assembly forces to push through and establish a defensive line. That's enough time to turn this from a rout into a stalemate. He turned to look at me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd spent 2 decades studying humans without fully understanding until that exact moment. It wasn't bravery, wasn't even courage in any traditional sense. It was something more fundamental. Acceptance. Not of death, but of the cost of meaning. These humans had decided that dying for something was better than living for nothing. It was the most alien thing I'd ever witnessed. The final assault was less a battle and more a controlled demolition where the humans were both the explosives and the engineers. They formed a spearpoint formation, the heaviest ships at the front absorbing catastrophic damage while fighters and bombers penetrated deeper into the Keresh defensive sphere. The Indomitable led the charge, shields buckling under sustained fire, hull plating vaporizing, entire sections venting atmosphere. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 9, damage control reported. Reactor containment at 40%. Forward batteries offline. We've lost port thrusters. Keep firing, Hale ordered. All remaining power to weapons. Helm, ramming speed. I felt the ship lurch forward, accelerating directly toward a Keresh command vessel that was easily 10 times our mass. Around us, the last fragments of the human fleet did the same, every surviving ship committing to one final, desperate attack. The Keresh tried to stop them. They really did. But distributed intelligence has a weakness that centralized command doesn't. In a crisis, when instant decisions mean survival, having to coordinate responses across thousands of semi-autonomous nodes creates fatal delays. The humans punched through. The Indomitable, burning and broken, crashed directly into the Keresh command ship central processor cluster at roughly 10% of light speed. The resulting explosion registered as a minor nova on the tactical sensors. 12 other human vessels made similar attacks in the same microsecond, overwhelming the Keresh command structure's ability to coordinate defensive responses. I survived because I was in the most heavily shielded observation blister, designed to survive exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. The escape pod ejected automatically, throwing me clear of the expanding debris field. Through the pod's small viewport, I watched the human fleet die. Every single ship. They'd kept their promise. They'd committed everything, held nothing back, and paid the price they'd always known would be demanded. But they'd cracked the Keresh command structure. I could see it on the pod's emergency sensors. The enemy fleet was drifting, uncoordinated, individual vessels operating independently without central guidance. The window the humans had promised, the 20 minutes of chaos, had opened exactly as predicted. And through that window came the assembly fleet. Not the token force that had been pretending to maintain evacuation corridors. The real fleet, the combined might of 200 species who had finally found something worth fighting for. They'd been watching the battle, watching humans die to prove that the Keresh could be hurt, could be confused, could be beaten. The humans had bought time with their lives, and the assembly had decided not to waste it. The Keresh never recovered their coordination. The assembly forces, finally committed to actual combat instead of strategic retreat, drove them back system by system. It took another 4 cycles of brutal fighting, but the Keresh expansion stopped, then reversed. They weren't defeated, not entirely, but they were no longer an unstoppable force of nature. They were just another problem the galaxy had to manage. I spent 3 cycles in medical recovery, my biology not designed for the kind of trauma that comes from watching an entire species commit to glorious suicide. The human losses had been even worse than projected. 94% casualties, with the remaining 6% scattered across rescue pods and disabled vessels. From a starting force of 3 million personnel and 247 ships, roughly 180,000 humans survived. The rest had died exactly as predicted, buying time that had cost them nearly everything. The assembly awarded them every military honor we could devise, which seemed almost insulting. What decoration adequately recognizes species-level sacrifice? But humans being humans, they didn't want monuments or memorials. They wanted to rebuild. Ambassador Rickshaw, one of the survivors, addressed the council 6 cycles after the battle. He stood in the same podium where he'd volunteered for suicide, looking older and more tired but fundamentally unchanged. "We didn't fight the Keresh to be heroes," he said. "We fought them because someone had to, and because we understood something the rest of you were still learning. Survival isn't about avoiding death. It's about making sure that when death comes, and it always comes, your life meant something beyond its duration." He paused, scanning the assembled delegates with those unnerving binocular eyes. "We paid the price you were all afraid to pay. We bought time with blood. And we did it knowing we probably wouldn't live to see the results. That's not heroism. That's just humanity. We've been doing it since we first looked up at the stars and decided they were worth reaching for. And now?" Supreme Arbiter Teln asked softly. Rickshaw's mouth curved into that tired smile I'd come to recognize. "Now we rebuild. We learn. We prepare for the next impossible thing that needs doing. Because there's always a next impossible thing." He straightened, and despite his obvious exhaustion, his voice grew stronger. "We survived the Keresh front. Some of us, anyway. And that means we won. Not because we defeated them completely, but because we're still here. We're still fighting. We're still choosing to matter." "Humanity chose survival," Teln observed. "No," Rickshaw corrected gently. "Humanity chose significance. Survival was just the fortunate side effect. I've spent the cycles since that battle studying human psychology, trying to understand what drives a species to such beautiful, terrible decisions. I've interviewed survivors, analyzed their cultural patterns, reviewed their entire violent history. And I've reached a conclusion that both comforts and terrifies me. Humans aren't special because they're smarter or stronger or more advanced. They're special because they've spent their entire existence learning how to fight impossible odds and refuse to accept defeat. They've built their entire civilization on the principle that meaning matters more than safety, that some things are worth dying for even when dying is the most likely outcome. The galaxy learned something from humanity's sacrifice. We learned that the Keresh could be fought, could be stopped, could be afraid. But more importantly, we learned what it means to commit, truly commit, to something larger than individual or even species survival. The humans taught us how to fight like we actually meant it. And the most terrifying thing? They're still here. Battered, reduced, traumatized, but rebuilding with the same stubborn determination that sent them charging into certain death. They're recruiting, training, preparing for the next crisis with absolute certainty that there will be a next crisis. Because that's what humans do. They survive. They adapt. They find ways to keep choosing significance over safety, meaning over preservation, defiance over surrender. Humanity paid the price of survival, a price that should have destroyed them completely. And they're still choosing to fight. I don't know whether to admire them or fear them. Probably both. Definitely both. But I know this. The next species that threatens the galaxy, the next impossible horror that emerges from the dark, will have to face humanity. And after what I witnessed at the Keresh front, after watching humans turn themselves into weapons and wielding their own mortality like a blade, I almost feel sorry for whatever comes next. Almost. Because humanity has learned that the way you survive impossible situations is to do impossible things. And they've gotten very, very good at impossible. The story ends here, but humanity's story? That's just beginning. And the galaxy will never be the same.